Have you ever seen a lens that can film at 3000 millimeters? I've got my hands on the brand new Nikon P1100 to test it out on some of the local wildlife that we have here in our parks and reserves. Special thanks to Nikon Singapore for lending me this unit. Before we continue, for those new to my channel, my name is Terence and I've been a wildlife photographer for the past 10 years. I am currently a Nikon ambassador and I've also worked with multiple other brands and organizations to create content around wildlife and wildlife photography. That said, this review is not sponsored and the opinions I provide here are my honest opinions. Do note that I am also approaching this camera from a beginner's perspective, as I do believe that this is the target market for this crazy super zoom camera. With this in mind, let's see whether this is the right camera for you. Alright, let's get one thing out of the way. I'm not here to bore you with a spec sheet. If you want all the numbers and charts and technical mumbo-jumbo, Nikon's website or about 100 other sites have you covered. What I'm here to do is to share my thoughts as a wildlife photographer, what I love, what I don't, and what actually matters when you're out in the field. Also, just a heads up, I have never actually used the P1000 camera, so if you're expecting a side-by-side comparison, that's not the video for you. But stick around because there is plenty to talk about with the Nikon P1100. Alright, let's first start with the exterior of the camera. For something that packs a ridiculous 24 to 3000 mm zoom range, it's surprisingly lightweight. I mean, think about it, holding that much zoom power in one hand, that's pretty wild. And I also love the really deep grip on this thing. It feels solid and secure, which is exactly what you want when you are tracking a distant bird or trying to keep your shot steady at 3000 millimeters. And then of course, there is that fully articulating LCD screen. This one's a bit of a personal preference. I do love a flip-out screen, but I get that not everyone does. One small but welcome upgrade from the P1000 is the addition of a USB-C port for charging. I love this. More and more cameras are ditching dedicated battery chargers in favor of USB-C, and honestly, I'm here for it. The P1100 jumping on that bandwagon just makes life easier. Now, one thing that threw me off at first, the button layout. If you're used to Nikon's mirrorless or DSLR lineup, be prepared for a bit of a learning curve. It took me a while to figure out what each button did, but that's no big deal. If you're coming from the P1000, this probably makes perfect sense to you. Speaking of buttons, can we talk about the on-off switch up here? I'm so used to having a dedicated toggle that I kept mistaking the power button for the video record button, which meant that instead of recording, I just, turn the camera off. Not ideal, but not a deal breaker either. Just something I need to get used to. And here's something I also did not expect. No touchscreen. It's not a huge problem because the physical buttons and dials work just fine, but if you're someone who grew up tapping and swiping on screens, then this might take a bit of getting used to. Now let's talk about that absolutely insane zoom range, 24 to 3000 millimeters. There is literally no other camera on the market that can do this aside from its predecessor, the P1000. But what does having that much zoom actually mean? So right now I'm just going to film some of the local birds that we have right here in our park with this new Nikon P1100, and let's see how that 3000 millimeters holds up with birds that are super far away. Well, for starters, 24mm is a great place to begin. It's wide enough for those establishing landscape shots, and with an f2.8 aperture, you can even shoot in lower light conditions. Plus, when filming in 4K, there is no crop, so 24mm is actually 24mm, which is nice. Now, I typically use lenses that go up to 600mm for my wildlife photography, and I've even held an 800mm lens before. But 3000mm, I think that's just incredibly absurd. So to put it into perspective, here's a quick demo of just how wild that reach really is. And since I've never shot anything at 3000mm before, it's been a totally different experience. Normally at 400 or 600mm, you can actually see what you're photographing, whether it's a bird, an animal, or whatever. But at 3000, it's less like a telephoto lens and more like a high-powered telescope. I use it to spot things I can't see with the naked eye. If I catch a glimpse of movement, in the distance that might be a bird, I can just zoom in, ID it, and confirm. On the flip side, this also makes photography a little lazy. What I mean is, with this kind of reach, I don't have to get closer to my subject. I just stand my ground, point the camera, and boom, fill the frame with whatever I was looking for. No more crawling through bushes or sneaking up on birds. The zoom does all of the work. Here's also what I found in my experience. If you're shooting photos at 3000mm, handheld is actually doable, thanks to the camera's built-in stabilization, which is kind of mind-blowing really. But if you're shooting video, handheld is not an option. Even on the tripod, framing something at 3000 is a huge challenge, and getting a stable shot is an even bigger one. If there's any wind or if you're on a wooden floor and someone walks by, every tiny vibration gets massively amplified. Even after trying all the different stabilization modes, I found that getting a truly steady shot at 3000mm was incredibly tough. Realistically, if I wanted usable video out of the camera, I would shoot at 1500mm or less to get the best possible results. Alright, next, let's dive into what's actually inside this camera. One feature that I really like is the startup zoom position. By default, every time you turn on the camera, it resets to 24mm. Now, zooming into 600mm takes about 2-ish seconds, and all the way to 3000 takes about 4-ish seconds. That's pretty fast, but when you are spotting a bird and scrambling to frame your shot, every millisecond counts. Thankfully, you can customize where the zoom starts when you turn the camera on. I set mine to 135mm, which is the longest option available. Not ideal, I would love to start somewhere at say 400mm instead, but hey, it's still better than starting at 24mm every time. Another surprise, the number of focus area modes. You get face priority, spots, subject tracking, and auto area autofocus, giving you plenty of flexibility. Autofocus is generally decent, but in bad light or extreme backlighting, it does tend to hunt quite a bit. Now, let's talk image quality. Look, I wasn't expecting miracles from a small sensor like this camera. If you're coming from a full-frame camera, like I am, the difference is honestly night and day. The P1100's photos are okay. They're not super sharp, but perfectly fine for social media. However, where this camera really struggles is in low light. Noise starts creeping in around ISO 400, and by ISO 1600, things get rough. Of course, noise reduction software can help, but for wildlife photography, where I am often in low light situations, this is something definitely that you want to keep in mind. One thing that really threw me off, no dedicated ISO button. I use ISO adjustments all the time, so not having a quick access button was definitely frustrating. I did set the control ring to adjust ISO, but you still have to click and scroll to get to the setting that you want, and it's not exactly quick. And here's the weirdest thing, you can't use auto ISO in manual mode. That's something I use all the time on my full-frame camera, so I found it pretty strange. Oddly enough, auto ISO does work in shutter and aperture priority modes, but not in full manual. Not sure why Nikon made that decision, but it's something definitely to be aware of. So, what's my final verdict? Who is this camera really for? Well, let's be honest, this is a very niche camera. It's perfect for someone who is just getting into birding, wants to dip their toes into wildlife photography, or let's be real, if you need to do a bit of spy work. I mean, if you're really trying to read someone's text messages from across a football field, this might just be the camera for you. Well, jokes aside, I've had a ton of fun while using it while I had the chance. That 3000mm reach opens up a whole new world of possibilities that simply don't exist with any other camera on the market. It's like having a telescope with a shutter button. But for me, as someone who's been doing wildlife photography for years, I would much rather hone my skills and get physically closer to birds and other animals instead of relying on extreme zoom. There is something about the process of sneaking in and reading animal behavior and working for the shot that makes the experience way more rewarding. This camera, it makes photography almost too easy. That said, if image quality isn't your biggest concern and reach is your top priority, then I highly recommend this camera. There's simply nothing else like it, especially in such a compact package. If you need an all-in-one insane zoom camera that lets you capture things other cameras can't dream of, this is the camera for you. If you enjoyed this video, remember to hit that like button, comment and subscribe. You can also support this channel by buying me a cup of coffee as well. Link in the description down below.